you for coming, everyone. I know you must be very busy with study and whatever else. See if we can find. Here we go. So I actually want to speak about a topic that's a little bit broader than just climate change per se. As much as we heard that's a quote-unquote controversial topic, it's controversial to who? I can tell you now in the scientific community it's not controversial at all, but in the media, in certain political spheres, and I won't get too political today, so don't worry, it's controversial. But there's a broader framework for understanding what it is that human beings are doing to the planet and how Christians might respond, and it's called the Anthropocene. So let me define that for you. So geologists like lines in the sand, quite literally sometimes, by which I mean if you want to divide the full history of the Earth, and I apologise if you're a young Earth creationist, but I'm going to espouse an old Earth chronology, 4.5 billion years old, they like to look for rock records that give you a particular signal that says this marks off a specific age. So for example, 65.5 million years ago, there's a thin layer of rock around the globe full of something known as iridium, which is a rare earth metal, which means it's not typically found in high concentrations on the Earth, but it also matches a very large crater in the Yucatan Peninsula off Central America where a meteorite hit. And if you look at the rocks below that, you find a lot of dinosaur fossils, and if you look at the rocks above that, you find no dinosaur fossils, except of course for birds, which evolved from dinosaurs. I'm also assuming evolution. I'm sorry if you don't. Them's the breaks. We can talk about that after. And so it's very simple to say, well, this marks off the Cretaceous period and this is the Tertiary period, because this is line in the sand, quite literally. The Anthropocene is the claim that human beings are now a major geological force on the planet. So if you look at paleontology, if you look at geology, if you look at paleoclimate, which is climate through the Earth history, you can talk about the impacts of the sun getting brighter, about variations in the Earth's orbit as it moves about the role of volcanoes, about the role of changing ocean circulations. But the claim for the Anthropocene now is that human beings currently eclipse all those forces. So what I've got here for you, let me explain. It's a plot of temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations, and they're taken from ice cores. Now I won't go into the details of temperature, but essentially the temperature is related to two different isotopes of oxygen. And so you can see the Pleistocene, which immediately precedes what we've referred to as the Holocene, or the recent period, is marked by generally colder conditions than we observe today. It's also marked by carbon dioxide concentrations much lower than today. Now, to head off something at the pass, climate skeptics will say, oh, there's no clear relationship in the past between carbon dioxide and temperature. Carbon dioxide can be a forcing term for climate, or it can be a feedback. Think about the difference between strumming the strings on a guitar. I plug my electric guitar into the amplifier and I strum the strings and I get a sound out. This plucking of the strings is the forcing mechanism. Now if I stick it in front of the amplifier, I get a squealing sound that many heavy metal guitarists really like to generate. That's referred to as feedback. And so in the past, changes in the Earth's orbit or changes in ocean circulations would cool the oceans, and the oceans would absorb more carbon dioxide. Colloquially speaking, holds more moisture, which means that you've got sufficient rainfall to grow crops. And if you can grow crops, you can develop a population and have more people and clear more land and grow more crops and so on and so forth. And so the Anthropocene, the Holocene, which begins about 11,000 years ago, marks a period where cities developed, agriculture developed, writing systems, all the world's major religions, and all that on the back of a very stable climate, notwithstanding long-term droughts which took care of the mire and all sorts of things like that. Civilizations came and went. But the very concept itself of human civilization developed in that period. And what you can see right at the end of that plot, over the past 150 years ago, is a large spike in carbon dioxide concentrations, and associated with that is a large spike in global mean average temperatures. That is, if you like, the smoking gun of climate change science. Because in order to deny that, not only do you have to deny the accuracy of a whole bunch of records, but some fairly fundamental and foundational science that's over 150 years old. And this spike in carbon dioxide just happens to coincide with the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, where human beings started to burn more and more fossil fuels. Now you can see there's some variability in the carbon dioxide concentrations, and some scientists suggest that you can see there's an upturn about 5,000 years ago, or even earlier, that's associated with the origins of agriculture. Because as I already said, if you want to feed people with wheat and barley and rye, etc., you need area to grow that. And so if you look at historical reconstructions of clearing of forests. Most of Europe, most of Western Europe was cleared by 1000 AD, which introduces an interesting moral question when we point at the Indonesians or people living in Brazil and say, you shouldn't clear your rainforests because they're important carbon sinks. Well, what are we willing to pay for it? Because Europeans and their descendants living in countries like Australia, who've also cleared most of our forests now, we've already done it. So that's kind of interesting. But the whole idea of the Anthropocene is that something's very different to the period in which human civilization has developed and we've enjoyed stable conditions. So it's common now to talk about what's referred to as planetary boundaries. I think it's David Attenborough who said there's only economists who believe that you can have infinite growth in a finite system. Simply can't be done. And so you run up into natural boundaries that limit what you can do. So there are 9 of these, and I'll go through them very briefly. The first, of course, is climate change. And what you can see there is a plot of carbon dioxide concentrations. They go up and down with the seasons because of snow and ice covering the northern boreal forests. But the trend is upwards, and we've now passed, well and truly passed 400 parts per million. We've not seen that in millions of years. Okay, concomitant with that, the plot down the bottom is showing some shells in water where they've added carbon dioxide. If you add carbon dioxide, as a very brief chemistry lesson, to water, you get a very weak acid. And that erodes at the shells of marine creatures, it erodes at coral reefs and so on and so forth. And so the oceans are slowly becoming more and more acidic over time. We have been killing off animals. You would be familiar with the dodo, which was hunted to extinction. You might not be familiar with the passenger pigeon. I've got this wonderful quote that talks about the passenger pigeon. It's a pigeon that used to live in North America. And over a period of 50 years, they hunted it to extinction. There's this wonderfully graphic description of their, what birds do. It falling like snowflakes and not being able to see the sun for 3 whole days as huge flocks of the passenger pigeon passed overhead. Now they're all dead. We're very good at clearing land, which is the plot shown below, and that's a major driver in terms of species extinction. We use the majority of the fresh water on the planet, whether or not it's in dams, for agriculture, for drinking, increasingly being wasted in soft drinks and coal seam gas mining, and now, I know this is a political statement, but hang it, the Queensland government wanting to give away free water to wash coal, water that could be used for agriculture. And of course, every time someone living in a remote arid community uses artesian or bore water, they're tapping into fossil water, which was laid down tens of thousands of years ago when there was more rainfall in the region. So countries like Libya are drawing upon, or Syria, are drawing upon increasingly depleted water reserves. And in fact, climate change and water availability was a major factor in driving the current conflict in Syria. Then you've got biogeochemical flows, which is simply a fancy way of saying we've used too much fertiliser and in an insensitive manner. So fertilisers are great on the land when they're fertilising crops, but when they get into the waterways, they fertilise the growth of algae, that green stuff that sits on the top. And sometimes they produce toxic emissions, but when they die, when they decay, that process of decay uses up oxygen. And so the waters become depleted in oxygen, and the world's waterways, rivers, lakes, and regions near the coast are now oxygen depleted in many parts of the world, and therefore fish free, because fish breathe underwater. Atmospheric aerosol loading. Has anyone ever visited a major city in China? Yeah, a couple of you. And you see what a lot of people wear. They wear those surgeons' masks, which are largely ineffective, by the way, at filtering the particulate matter. And so we fill the air with particulates and make it very difficult to breathe. Hundreds of thousands of people die each year due to respiratory diseases. Of course, we've always done that, and you can read an account, and his name's gone out of my head, but there's a 1st century Roman senator and philosopher who observed that his health improved as soon as he left Rome because of the poor air quality. So we've always been doing it, but we're doing it on a grander and grander scale. Stratospheric ozone depletion. You all know about the ozone hole. It's one of the few success stories. We had an international protocol which saw the banning of ozone depleting CFCs. So it gives us a ray of hope. And novel entities. That picture that you can see up in the top, my top right, is eggshells, which have become brittle because of the use of DDT, which is a pesticide. We now find DDT in the shells of Adelie penguins in Antarctica, but it's never been sprayed in Antarctica. It's forecast by 2050 that there'll be more plastic in the oceans than fish. And plastic doesn't go away. It just gets tinier and tinier and tinier and travels up the food chain. So all these things represent boundaries which not only provide environment for the cute and cuddly, the furry and the feathered, but for human beings as well, for our own crops, for the filtration of our drinking water, for our drinking water itself, for the next cure to cancer, for all sorts of natural resources. If you live in the developing world, your supermarket is the forest. If you clear all the forest, where do your medicines come from? Where do your building materials come from? Where does your food come from? So you get the picture. And I won't dwell on this, but what it shows you is that the definite kind of geological period begins in the mid to late 50s. It's obviously post-World War II. The American economy was driven by the war. When men came back from the war, people are saying, well, what do we do now? How do we build our economy? It's one built on consumption. It's no coincidence that about that time, or a little bit earlier, advertising agencies started employing psychologists to make you want to buy things. So one of the major driving factors of the Anthropocene, and in fact some people refer to it as the Capitalocene, because it's largely driven by, and again I'm being political, capitalism, which isn't the simple owning the means for production, as we had at the start of the Industrial Revolution, but it's shareholder capitalism with a CEO who gets paid ridiculous large amounts to run the company into the ground and still gets a huge bonus when he leaves, and run the environment into the ground by making you unhappy with the way that you look or the things that you have. And so you can see, of course, the thing about the Great Acceleration is there have been real benefits to human society as a whole. Nutrition, health, all these sorts of things. But you can see a rise in world population, a rise in world GDP, urbanisation of the planet, so we all move towards the cities, large dams, fertiliser consumption, but then on the other side, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane are all greenhouse gases driving global warming, stratospheric ozone depletion, surface air temperature going up, ocean acidification going up, coastal nitrogen, which are those areas where they're oxygen poor and fish free, going up, and so on and so forth. So this great acceleration has provided great benefits, particularly for those of us in the first world, but it's also come at great cost. I'm going to hand it over to you for a few minutes. I want to ask you a couple of questions. And the first one's kind of tied to, would there be anyone who wasn't of a Christian faith, but we can address it as well. What might it mean to have a spiritual connection to the world around us? And particularly if you're a Christian, has Christianity been good, bad or indifferent for the environment? What are your thoughts? Put your hand up and tell me your name so that I can forget it 30 seconds later like a goldfish, and then give me your thoughts. Yes?
I'm Mia.
Hi, Mia.
I think Christianity's been had a pretty bad track record with the environment, and it's really been a victim of capitalism and kind of part of a vicious cycle of reinforcing it as well. And yeah, theology has suffered a lot, and the Bible's been interpreted in ways that have placed humans in a really damaging relationship with the environment.
I think that's spot on. When what we could refer to it in Luther's terms as the Babylonian captivity of the church. You could say it starts with Constantine and Christianity no longer being a persecuted religion, but in fact being the state religion, and us being very comfortable with all the aspects of empire. And if you look at the history of colonisation throughout the world, it's the gunships went first, and then the Christian missionaries went afterwards, and let's take their resources and use their human capital. And we've just become so comfortable with that we need to take another look at ourselves. That's helpful. Does anyone ever heard the name Lynn White? Lynn White was a medieval historian who wrote a paper in the 60s that basically made that claim that Christianity was the major cause of environmental destruction in the world, which I think is a bit naive in a sense, because he wanted to blame Marxism on us, which I think is a bit harsh, and doesn't explain, for example, what the Japanese are doing, asked David Suzuki. But he said that the major Western traditions of Christianity were very individualistic and very anti-creation, very Gnostic in their outlook, but he held up St. Francis of Assisi as one thread. I mean, when we talk about Christianity, that's a bit naive as well. We need to think about Christianity as different traditions. We always like to think that we sit at the centre. That's a trap for me as well when I'm producing or preaching this stuff, but it's not all bad news, but a lot of it is. Any other thoughts? Can you give me examples? Or, for example, had you really thought about the connection between your faith and climate change before you saw the ad to come and listen to this old man rave on? Had it ever occurred to you? One? Couple nods? Who's heard a sermon in their church about creation and looking after it? Well, that's encouraging. Where do you go to church? Ah, you would have heard me. Of course, you've got Joe Knight from TIER as well. I will plug my new book at the end, which is at the Justice Conference, a TIER-sponsored event. Well, that's encouraging. There are a few pockets, but it's by no means kind of uniform. Let's move on then. That's good, thank you. So, what is the mission of the church? So I talk a lot about something known as eco-missiology, which leaves people going, what the heck is he talking about? But let's think firstly about the mission of the church. Of course, it's in Matthew 28, is it not? How many people have got that memorised? It's a missionary's favourite text. It's a missionary organisation's favourite text. The end of Matthew's Gospel, which is the Jewish Gospel, if you will. And let me read it to you. And Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And so one of the things that I think Christians often miss is it talks of what Jesus says in Matthew 28 is the fulfillment of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who are in heaven, see, I'm an Anglican, I know these things. Hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then at the end, after the resurrection, after he's been crowned King of Israel on the cross and raised from the dead to validate that claim, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, if that shouldn't produce bold Christians, I don't know what would. But it's saying that Christ is in charge right now of earthly things and not just spiritual things. But everyone thinks that it's just all about the spiritual. Secondly, it says make disciples and not just make converts or make clones of us or make other Anglicans or other Baptists or other whatever your denomination is. To baptise, and we fight over what that means, and to observe all that I have commanded. Now, there's a problem with that for me straight away because anyone who's familiar with Monty Python, Jesus didn't say, blessed are the cheesemakers, but neither did he say, blessed are the tree planters. So straight away there's a problem if we then look straight to Jesus to look for an ethical imperative for caring for creation, because you won't find it explicitly there. There are ways of getting at that, and I'll talk about that at the end with regards to my book. But so just to summarise, the church has often produced converts, not disciples. We're often perceived as God bothering but not godly living, so pestering people with the gospel but not matching our words, and you can only see that. You can see that specifically in all the sex scandals in the church, and it's often included in the neglect of justice and the protection of our power. So here's our central position in society, and we'll hold on to that power and so on at all costs, and we also protecting clergy against victims and all sorts of stuff, but sometimes neglecting issues of justice. So that has consequences for then thinking about, well, if we're Christians and we read the Bible through the lens of Jesus, what do we do about the environment if he never said anything about it? In fact, when I was an undergraduate, that's a long time ago, 1988 was my first year at Monash. I think it was 89. At Monash University, there was an AOG pastor debated Peter Singer. People know who Peter Singer is? An infamous ethicist. And it was over whether or not Christianity provided a good ethical system. And Singer said, despite the fact, apart from the fact that I don't believe in God, one can't base an ethical system on Christianity because Jesus cursed the fig tree and he cast demons into swine. So we're already starting on the back foot. But then, of course, he's assuming a lot in those claims anyway. But anyway, I want to define for you something briefly that I spend a lot of time thinking about. It's known as ecotheology. You might think, what the heck is ecotheology? And why it's not a theology of ecology or whatever else. It's theology, so it should be always God-centred. And not every ecotheologian does the practice this way. But it's interesting, to my mind, that the prefix echo comes from the Greek word oikos. Does anyone read the New Testament in Greek? I kind of sort of do. It's very rusty. So oikos means household. And so you could talk about the slave who was responsible for managing the day-to-day affairs of the household as the oikoduname, I think. Anyway. but it gives us the root word for economy and ecology. And so it's interesting that I've got a figure on the right there. That's the from a new book called Donut Economics. That might get some of you thinking about donuts, but what it means is that a proper economy should run between two confines. And the first is people's need and desire for health and food and water and income and education and jobs and access to energy, etc. And then those planetary boundaries on the outside. And so ecotheology, I think, should properly address the relationship between human society and culture and the economy and the natural limits that ecology sets in place, or God has set in place through ecology. So Clive Eyre is an Australian ecotheologian, and he says that it's a recognised descriptor of an approach that sets theology in dialogue with contemporary ecology. So we talk to ecologists, we think about ecology. How does that reflect upon our faith, and how does our faith reflect back upon ecology? And so you can see there I've got a dinky little schematic that ecology is a lens through which we view the Bible, because just as throughout church history very often the voices of women have been oppressed and women characters in the Bible have not been heard properly, so has the non-human creation. I'll give you an example. I was at a church for a while and I heard a sermon about the Samaritan woman. And this male preacher made her out essentially to be a prostitute, a woman of a two-dimensional character of loose moral values. And then I heard a respected friend of mine who has worked for TIA give a sermon, and she brought the perspective of Dalit women, the untouchable women from India, and said, here's a woman who possibly was infertile. Here's a woman who was whose husband died and under the Levirate law had to marry one of her husband's brothers, and maybe he died, and so on and so forth. So it's all about perspective, it's all about hermeneutics, because we all pretend that we read the Bible in an unmediated fashion, but we all read the Bible from our own perspective, and we need to constantly challenge our perspective on how we read the Bible. That's what commentaries are for, that's what Christian community is for, that's what guest speakers are for. And so Eyre goes on to say that it's dialogue between theology and contemporary ecology, and asserts that our care of the natural world or of God's creation, and that's the thing we need to keep asserting, is that the world around us is a creation of God, a good creation of God, Genesis 1, is not just a practical issue but a faith issue as well. That makes sense? I had that insight 30 years ago, and it first started me studying philosophy and theology at the time, is if God has made everything as the creator, then surely I need to think Christianly about everything. Not just about my quiet time, not just about cold turkey evangelism as I used to do, and scripture memory and all the things that navigators are really good at promoting, but about everything else, like my studies and whatnot. Okay, so we don't have time to go into each of these chapters in detail. I've got 20 minutes to go, and I've got so many things to say. It's what happens when you spend over 2 decades of your life thinking about this. Lots of Christians think the Bible is not about how the heavens go, but how to go to heaven, in essence. That's a nice way around the issues of science versus faith, but I think it's very naive. In other words, it's important that you read your Bible as often as you can, on a daily basis, and you draw spiritual sustenance from it, because how else do you know and relate to God but from God's inspired word? But it's more than that, believe it or not. And the Bible's full of rules and commandments. But there was a meeting a few years ago of a gathering of Southern Baptists in the United States, and they said the Bible says nothing specific about climate change, therefore we have no official position. The Bible doesn't mention condoms and microwaves and jumbo jets and you name it. There's not a lot in the Bible about these sorts of things, right? So that's very naive. There are commands that we should follow. It seems to me the principal command is to love God and love neighbour. But nonetheless, there are rules. But part of the problem that we have always fallen into is we abstract the rules into what we call systematic theology apart from the big story, because the Bible is a story, a narrative from creation to new creation and God's movements in it. And so Tom Wright, who's a writer that I recommend to any Christian I ever speak to, a very gifted academic theologian, but writes very accessible books, says that the Bible is a bit like a 5-act play. Now, imagine that you are part of a Shakespearean theatre company. Anyone like Shakespeare? Bit of William? And you've been doing that all your adult life, which for all of you isn't very long, but you get the picture, right? So I'm 47, I can make jokes about age now. that you've done every play that he's ever written, and you've studied the contemporary period, and you know all about the history, and you've got authentic looking costumes, and everything that he's ever done or been written about him, you're across. You are the principal Shakespearean theatre company. And then in somebody's attic, they discover a long lost Shakespearean play. And so that Shakespearean play has the first 4 acts and setting the scene of the 5th act and the end, but it's missing the bits in between. So you say, oh, that's all very good, and we'll write a book about it, and we'll stick that manuscript in a drawer. No, you're not. You're going to think, how are we going to present this to an audience? And the one thing you're going to need to do is to improvise the 5th act, shaped by everything that you know about the first 4 acts and where the play is going and everything you've ever known about Shakespeare. You see, there's so much the Bible doesn't talk about in the New Testament period, but we know that the world has fallen. Human beings have, sorry, no, we don't know the world has fallen. We know human beings have fallen or faulty or twisted, morally misaligned. We know we don't live in paradise now, and we don't live in the age of the people of Israel. We don't live in the promised land. We're the diaspora of the Christian church. And we don't live with Jesus walking around holding a hand and teaching us, but we live in the age of the church and the age of the Spirit. And we know we have some rough word pictures of what the new heavens and the new earth will be like. And so how do I live Christianly in this age, faithful to this story? I keep reading it and reading it and rereading it and thinking about the sorts of things that I should be doing. And so if Jesus doesn't specifically say, blessed are the tree planters, it doesn't matter, because, as you'll see, he fulfills the story of the history of Israel. All the promises of God, Jesus fulfills as Israel's Messiah, the true King, and speaks and acts in a way so uniquely identified with the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that the first Christians were forced to call him God, because there was no other conclusion they could draw. So you get that picture? It's not once upon a time. I'm not saying it's full of fables and made up stuff, although there are parables and we can argue about the historical nature of bits of it, but it's a narrative that's pointing in a direction. So let me briefly identify a few bits and pieces. So really what I'm doing is highlighting a methodology for you to go away and think about, or buy a book of mine when it comes out. So a couple of bits of Hebrew. The creation account. At the end of Genesis chapter 1, we have Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. It's where those who put the chapter and verses in didn't do us any favours. So you've got 2 creation accounts which are sandwiched together, and they're different, but their final editor knew that. That's okay. And it says that God rests from his creative acts. And the Hebrew word is Shabbat, from where we get Sabbath, which means rest. And it's linked with the word Nuha, which means rest, right? And in Exodus 20, where the 10 Commandments are given, we read, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested, Nuha, on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and made it holy. He blessed the day in which God ceased his creative activity. Now, I used to work in Docklands, and there were a lot of buildings going up, and you'd see the tradies come in on smoko, and resting from their work meant putting their feet up and having fried food and sugary drinks, as you do, right? Got better arteries than me. What does it mean for God to rest? Does it mean that God puts his feet up, and this is the deist view of the world, and winds up the clock and goes and makes a cup of tea and doesn't bother with humanity or the world again? And if clearly that's not the case, what does it mean for God to rest? And the answer is given in Psalm 132. It makes it very clear. Now, Psalm 132 is a pilgrim psalm, a psalm of ascents. It's what you said as a Jewish person when you went up to the temple once per year. And it says, let us go to his dwelling place, that's God, where God lives. Let us worship at his footstool, that is his throne room. Rise up, O Lord, and go to your resting place. And it's related to the word in Genesis and Exodus, the word rest. You and the ark of your might. So you've all seen Indiana Jones. You all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? No? I know it's a generation or so ago, but nonetheless, good movie. All about the Ark of the Covenant, and God was meant to meet the people above the ark. And so what the psalmist is saying ties in with what's being said by the writer of Genesis and the writer of Exodus, that creation was created as a resting place for God. In other words, creation is a place where God can dwell. In other words, as in every other contemporary ancient Near Eastern culture, creation itself is a temple. to contain God. Notwithstanding what Solomon said when he dedicated the temple, that even the heavens and the earth can't contain God, yet the biblical picture is of a creation, a good creation made for God to dwell in. And that makes it holy. That makes it sacred. That destroys any divide, by the way, of the careers you're going to go out and have and working for church. Don't be suckered into the lie that somehow being ordained or being a church worker or working on campus for the CU is more holy than what you're going to be doing at the end of your degrees. They're very worthwhile callings, and I once considered being ordained. Thank God I wasn't. I've got a calling now. But what's the other implication of that? If you go to Bali, you go to India and you find a Hindu temple, they're full of what other than Hindus? Because I've had that response before. What are they full of? Idols. Images of the many deities that the Hindus worship. Genesis 1:27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the word for image is the word icon, from which we get icons in the Greek and Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, Catholic Church. It's what makes idolatry such a nonsense. You want to see the image of God? Turn around and look at the person next to you. There's the image of God. And so what that says is that we have a sacred vocation to care for the earth, to cultivate it, to look after it, to manage it. Now, we can quibble about the word management. And so when you see in Genesis 2:15 a different creation account, it says, then the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. They're actually religious words. And so what it's saying, in other contexts in the Old Testament, they use in a religious, priestly sense. And so we have a priestly vocation to look after the world. What does it say in 1 Peter? A holy nation, or a royal priesthood, a people belonging to God. And one of the things, and we don't have time to dig into it, is when you look at the Old Testament, the fall has a profound effect upon the whole of creation. So the flood narrative is an undoing of what happened in Genesis 1, where God separates the waters from waters above and below, and the land from the waters. And what happens in the flood? Runs in the opposite direction, an act of uncreation. We don't have time to talk about the Old Testament. I hate skipping the Old Testament because Christians do that way too much. But the land is central. Has anyone read any Graham Goldsworthy? There's a Sydney scholar. He talks about God's people in God's place under God's rule. So God's people, the nation of Israel, in the promised land, experiencing shalom, which meant not just the freedom from war, but the freedom to enjoy cultivating land and worship God, under God's rule, the Torah. Or if you took Genesis 12:1-3, with God's blessing, which was a blessing they were meant to take to the rest of the nations. There's mission for you. I'm running out of time. This I find really exciting, and what this does is highlights to us that in the New Testament, in the Gospels themselves, is the link that we need between the first Adam, who was meant to serve God by caring for the garden, and the second Adam, Jesus, who you think has nothing to do with that. So you see the parallels, and Craig Keener, a New Testament theologian, says that John 1 is about Christology, not cosmology per se, but look at the parallels between Genesis chapter 1 and John chapter 1. In the beginning, we read in both, God, and in John it's the Logos, who was with and was God. So there's the beginnings of Trinitarian theology. Created the heavens and the earth, and all things came into being through the Logos. And God creates light and darkness, and in John we read that the light, Jesus the light, the life of all people, and darkness doesn't overcome it or understand it. So we have the Creator himself literally pitching a tent amongst humanity, tabernacling, recalling the Exodus narrative. But there are echoes in the end of John as well, which when I first saw these I was quite gobsmacked. So Genesis 2, in the day the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the first day of creation. We read in John 20, on the first day of the week. We see the creation of light in Genesis chapter 1, and it was still dark when Mary goes into the garden. In Genesis 2, God puts man into the garden, and John 20:15, Mary supposes Jesus to be the gardener. John is smacking us right between the eyes with the literal wet fish. Look at this. In Genesis 2:22, man and woman are in the garden, and a woman is a fit helper for the man to carry out the ministry of caring for the creation. And just as an aside, In the Old Testament, God is described as man's helper as well. So that's not an uneven thing. I know I'm getting very contentious here. And who's the first apostle in the New Testament? To get even more contentious, it's actually Mary, because she's sent to announce the resurrection to the disciples. In Genesis 2:24, man clings to his wife, but Jesus says, Mary, don't cling to me because I'm going back to the Father. So we're meant to see that through the resurrection of Jesus is the renewal of all things and the renewal of the human vocation to rule wisely over the earth. If you then follow that up with Colossians chapter 1, you see how a theology of the cross, what's commonly known as the atonement. Go home and read Colossians 1 and Ephesians chapter 1. For he is the image of the invisible God. That word image again. The firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth. Visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, as kind of an aside from all things, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. So the first one resurrected, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, the pleroma of God, and through him to reconcile, guess what? All things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So whether or not it's the Taliban or ISIS or the present American government or our government or major corporations that burn fossil fuels or the whole creation itself, all these things can be and are going to be reconciled to God through the blood of Jesus on the cross. And so that's a little bit broader than me and Jesus. As much as you don't go past that, you need a personal relationship with Jesus. But it's a bit like when the whole picture of this kingship of Jesus is a bit like when Caesar rocked into town. Augustus Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, whoever. And the Romans arrived and brought the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Do you know how the Pax Romana? What have the Romans ever done for us? The Pax Romana. Kill all your armies, crucify anybody who resists, and tax them into annihilation. That's what the Romans ever did to anyone in the first century. So you weren't invited into a personal relationship with Tiberius Caesar or Augustus Caesar. And yet Romans contrast Jesus as Son of God with Caesar as Son of God. Jesus is the one who brings us peace with God versus the Roman peace. He's writing this letter to the people in Rome. So it's a bit like Philippians 2 when it says that every knee will bend and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. So inherent in that is kind of an invitation to a personal relationship with him, because if you don't have one, then your knee will bend anyway. But it's a bit like saying, well, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. So do you choose to be under that authority? And so that's a bit broader than just your prayers and your Bible reading. You see the difference? So you get, in this broader understanding, everything that you ever thought Christianity was about, and a whole lot more. You don't lose anything. Okay. And finally, and just very briefly, before we finish, creation's groaning. There is no such thing as the rapture, and the earth won't be burnt up in flame. You need to understand 2 Peter 3 correctly. Read what Paul says in Romans chapter 8. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will. You know, the birds and the bees didn't decide one day, let's suffer. But of the will of the one who subjected it, which is God, which is kind of a curious text to base an ecotheology on, but let's think about that in a minute. In the hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom and the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now. Think about the narrative of the Exodus. God says, I've heard the groanings and the cries of my people, and he rescues them from slavery to Egypt and puts them into the promised land. He leads them by the fiery pillar at night and the smoky pillar during the day. In Romans it says that we've been freed from slavery to sin and that we're led by the Spirit. And there are all these echoes of the Exodus, and then you get to the very end and it doesn't say that we go to heaven when we die. It says that creation itself will be set free from its bondage, its slavery to decay. That idea of storytelling, again and again, the Exodus is retold and retold and retold, and it includes the non-human creation. And I think the groaning and labour pains refers to the bodily resurrection, the earth giving up the dead. And the whole key that it's looking forward to the resurrection is that the bondage to decay that Paul's talking about in Romans 8 isn't primarily animal death or suffering, as tragic as all those things are, but the fact that we stuff it up. Because even Paul in the first century could see the Tiber River in Rome filled with silting up, the Tiber River being filled with human excrement. So we all marvel at Roman aqueducts. There's a reason they needed to build them, because they couldn't drink from the river. The air quality, the land clearing, all those things first century people were not ignorant to. Environmental degradation. And Paul could see these things and could see that humans were mismanaging the planet, and the planet itself was groaning for Christ's return, where we would be remade in the image of God and we would rule wisely as Adam was meant to do. That's the narrative from creation to new creation. So, echo mission. Reconciliation at all levels. Remember the threefold curse in Genesis 3, and I'm about to wrap up, is broken relationships between God and human beings with each other, and frustration with the creation. So reconciliation at all levels. Eco-justice, because those who are suffering now, the worst ravages of climate change, are not first world people, but the people, Christian brothers and sisters living in Tuvalu and Tonga and Samoa, the islands that are disappearing beneath the waves, for example. Eco-spirituality, it means that go and look at the birds and the kangaroos and see the good works of a creator God, as I said at Mary Creek. Maybe you can plug the sermon because it's online. Eco-evangelism. When you tell non-Christians that God cares about the world, they'll actually start to listen. Things about sin and their spiritual life and all, very abstract. But if you say that God wants to bring justice to the world and wants to renew the world, and that includes them and their role that they play, you're likely to get more of a hearing, and I've had this before. And so on it goes. So to summarise then, my very last slide, the Anthropocene is the era of human domination of the planet, and we're making a mess of it. And should that surprise Christians who believe in the doctrine of sin? Christians have often thought of discipleship in very narrow terms, and we've often been at the forefront of damaging the world as well. Ecotheology is a repentant theology that admits that we've done wrong in the past, and it sees the environment as a faith issue. The Bible is a story to live by and tell, not simply a rule book. The story includes the other than human, because God cares for the sparrows in the air and the lilies of the field, and this means that Christians have a responsibility to act and help fulfill that narrative in the hope that Christ is returning to renew all things. That's a summary of 20 odd years of thought in about 30 to 40 minutes. So do we have any questions before I go back to work and you go to your lectures and hopefully not forget some of what I said? Stunned?
I'll ask a question. What would you say as a response to the argument that Christians ought not to worry about climate change because that represents a lack of trust in God?
Excellent question. Does climate change represent a lack of trust in God? Climate change springs from human greed, ignorance and sin, which are things that we're meant to address and preach against. So even if you took the argument, and some Christians do that climate change is a manifestation of the end times, therefore it's God's will, if you read Isaiah talks about God bringing judgment on the Israelites through the Assyrians. And so it was a deliberate act of God to judge them for their sins. And yet he still judges the Assyrians because they lost sight of what it was they were meant to be doing. So even if the unfolding things means the end times is upon us, that doesn't mean that people get off lightly for the sins of consumption. And I mean, when did you last hear a sermon about gluttony, for example? Materialism, all those sorts of things. They all lead into climate change because, if you like, it's one thing to have one sinful person on their own doing sinful stuff. When you have a whole sinful society, the impacts become huge. The other thing is that it's our vocation to look after the planet. That's the whole narrative that I've been trying to expand. And so therefore, to miss the point that climate change is a result of our mismanagement of the planet is to be continually unrepentant. I mean, I understand that it's not everyone's calling to be an eco-prophet and eco-theologian. Some people are primarily evangelists and some people are going to be vets and teachers and whatever else. But it doesn't mean that we don't all play a role in caring for the planet. So we're all called to spread the good news, but we're not all quote-unquote evangelists in a professional sense. So we're all called to care for planet Earth. We're not all eco-theologians, eco-prophets, whatever else. Good question. Up the back, Mia.
How would you respond to the argument that the only healthy relationship there can be between humans and the non-human world is if we see ourselves as equal with everything else? Because I was getting a vibe that you still subscribe to like the more traditional view that humans are in some way above.
Are human beings above everything else? I think we have a different calling. If you look at, use some fancy words, the ontology of Genesis chapter 1, it's about function more than material. So it's not how the world was built, but it's about what is everything for. So the birds in the air and the fish in the sea, their function is to be fruitful and to multiply and to swarm and to flock. Ours is to care for the planet. It's certainly one of the things that evolutionary biology has taught us, that we're different to the rest of the creation only in degree and not in kind. Studies in neuroscience and animal behaviour and all the rest of it. And yet, if you look at, say, Psalm 8, what is it? When I consider the heavens and the earth, what is it that? Let me figure it out real quickly. What it says, in essence, if I can't find it in a hurry, is that it's not because human beings are necessarily smarter, and it's not because we've pulled ourselves up by our own evolutionary skyhooks. It's you've set the glory above the heavens. Where is it? When I look at your fingers, the work of the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established. What are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? So we actually need to extract, and I didn't have time to do that, a real proper sense of our fellowship with the rest of creation. There's only one line in reality, and it's between creator and created, not between human beings and the other animals. And in fact, there's a Hebrew expression, living creature in the English, nefesh, spirit or soul, and it's used to describe animals as well as human beings. So if someone says, does your dog have a soul? The answer is yes, according to the Hebrew Bible. But what the writer then goes on to say, yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honour. We've been elected, called by God to fulfil a specific role. It doesn't make us necessarily any more important, but I don't think we should underplay human uniqueness either. So it's kind of a tension between recognising that we are created, and therefore no different from any other animal, and yet we have a special calling and function which we're equipped to carry out. So it's not an either or, I guess is what I'm saying. I think that's what, you can go one of two ways, and both are wrong. Enough? One more question?
What do you see as some of the obstacles between this understanding of our need to care for creation and the church as it currently is?
Oh, where do you start? I think large sections of the church, probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks, other than how we've read the Bible in a Western individualistic sense, is fear of what's known as syncretism. If I start down this track, I'll become green and lefty, and it becomes very rapidly politicised, because the major party in Australia, for example, that advocates more radical action on climate change also advocates abortion and euthanasia, and you get tied up in all those sorts of issues. So it becomes a political package that you have to accept. And yet I don't accept that, because Christians should be the swinging vote par excellence. But also political involvement, and this does require political involvement because we're talking about systemic changes, not just do I change my light bulbs, goes beyond voting every 3 years. It's writing to politicians, it's marching, it's protesting outside of banks, and I've got a mate of mine in Sydney who's been arrested a couple of times at coal mines. Those sorts of things. It's about getting involved at that level. So not accepting the left-right dichotomy. We need to move beyond that. But there are theological impediments. There's very narrow theology about what Christ came to do. There's, as I said, individualism that feeds into that. There's this needing to go back to the Bible and reread it with fresh eyes, that God actually cares about these things. And it is, as someone said earlier, I think it was you, Mia, about the fact that we're so soaked up in our culture, consumerist culture, that we, Today I picked up a book that was talking about eating of animals and its link to climate change and etc. And I put it back down because I like my meat. So we all have something that we're hung up on that we need to get past. One more?
Practical ways that every Christian, some people will leave active and others, but practical ways that
Practical actions. When you start work, make sure that you're invested in a green superannuation fund. Consider moving away from the 4 major banks. I know that can be difficult. I'm kind of locked into one for the moment, but because they still put money into coal mines, the Commonwealth Bank's the last one holding out on saying we won't fund Adani. Going with a green energy provider. It's a power shop. Using public transport heaps. Eating less meat or no meat. That's up to you. Hassling your politicians regularly. Talking more with other Christians about this as a topic and not being afraid to be judged for it. That kind of thing, yeah. Keep thinking, be informed about as many issues as you possibly can. Read your Bible, buy good books. Last plug, I have a book called A Climate of Hope, Church and Mission in a Warming World, available through publication. And for those interested, the Justice Conference in October, which is was run by TIA, I've got a new book coming out called The Climate of Justice,